My story starts with my great-grandfather, Francesco Paolo Rizio. He was born in Palermo, Sicily, Italy. Back in Italy, he married a woman and had 6 children with this lady. The wife ended up dying from some kind of sickness. When the wife passed away, Francesco remarried to another woman. The woman's name was Michela Provenzano. While he was married to this lady, he had another 6 children, my grandmother, Giuseppina, being one of the 6 children born, and she was the second youngest. When my grandmother was younger, the youngest sibling passed away at a very young age. That now meant that my grandmother was the youngest sibling. She doesn't remember how he died, but she believes it was from the disease malaria. Francesco owned his own fish store, which meant that the family was doing pretty well for themselves, until he passed away. That's when times got rough. Francesco died at the age of 52 due to a heart attack. It was the time of the war. Michela couldn't handle taking care of all 11 children. So my grandmother's half-sister, Rosa, knew a lady who wanted to have children but wasn't able to. So because of the time of the war, all siblings were divided up. 2 kids went with the oldest sibling, 2 other kids went with the second oldest, and so on. Her oldest sibling, Rosa, not that she didn't love my grandmother, but she wanted her to have a better life. So she gave my grandmother to the lady that wasn't able to have children. No money was exchanged for the adoption of Giuseppina. The woman's name was Francesca Angelo. She was married to a man named Vincenzo. When my grandmother moved from one household to another, she also moved from the city of devastation due to war to a place where there was peace and quiet. Growing up, she had no jobs, but she was always busy around the vineyard where she lived. My grandparents first met when my grandfather worked as a tailor, which is a person who makes custom clothes and men's suits. My grandparents lived across the street from each other, and when they first started dating, they sneaked around because my grandmother's mom, Francesca, didn't approve of my grandfather and his family. She didn't approve of them because my grandfather's family wasn't that rich, and they didn't have much, where my grandmother's side was very wealthy. My grandparents dated for 2 years, and still Francesca didn't approve of him. My grandparents decided to get married, and on May 15, 1957, they eloped, which means that they didn't get married publicly. They got married privately with no one around, except for 2 close friends of my grandparents. My grandmother was 20 years old, and my grandfather was 27 years old. My grandfather, Damiano DiDio, was born on September 11, 1930. He was born in Trapani, Sicily, Italy. He was the son of Giovanni DiDio and Mariana Gardini. Giovanni was chief of police and was a very well-respected man, but unfortunately the pay wasn't very high, and he didn't have a lot of income. Mariana was a stay-at-home housewife. My grandfather had 4 siblings, 3 boys and 1 girl. From oldest to youngest, their names were Giovanni DiDio, Mariana DiDio, Salvatore DiDio, Damiano DiDio, and Filippo DiDio. My grandfather's dad, Giovanni, passed away at the age of 52 because of a blood clot in the brain, and at the age of 78, Mariana died from pneumonia. At the age of 20, my grandfather joined the military and served as a guard in the jail. Back then, when you turned 20, it was mandatory for you to join the army. The name of the best man who was at the wedding was Jacob. He was also the godfather of my dad. After the wedding, my grandparents moved into an apartment together, and it took 2 years for Francesca to talk to my grandmother. She didn't talk to her for 2 years because she was upset that she had married my grandfather, Damiano. On June 11, 1959, that was the time that my grandmother had seen Francesca in 2 years, because that was also the day that my Aunt Mariana was born. Francesca visited my grandmother and the newborn baby to see how she was doing, and after that day all was well again between my grandparents and Francesca. December 30th, 1962, Giuseppina gave birth to her second child. My dad, Giovanni DiDio, was delivered by a midwife in my grandparents' home, but they changed the date of his birth on the birth certificate to January 1st, 1963. Because back then, when you turned 20, you had to join the military, so they figured to pull back his birth 2 more days so he can have an extra year at home and not go in the army. The DiDio family came to Canada on March 19, 1966. They came by a boat called the Christopher Columbus. They stayed on the boat for 9 days, and they docked at Halifax. Then they took a train to Toronto for 2 days and 2 nights, and on March 21st, 1966, they were finally home to the new city, Toronto. The reason why they came to Canada was because they wanted to have a better life, and also the job opportunity in Canada was very high compared to the job opportunity in Italy. The first job my grandfather had was with a steel company, and the first job my grandmother had was working in an undergarment factory. Throughout the years of my grandparents living in Canada, they both worked for different factories. My dad, Giovanni DIDIO'S, still lived in Toronto all his life. He went to high school called George Harvey, where he met my mom, Ivana Barbusho. My mom was born on March 21st, 1964. She is a middle child. She has an older sister named Amelia and a younger brother named Pasquale. Her parents, my grandparents' names are Maria Ambroso and Agostino Barbuscio. My grandmother, Maria, was born in Celico, Calabria, Italy, on October 12, 1943. Her parents, my great-grandparents, were also from Celico, and their names were Immacolata Caruso, who was born in 1906, and Giuseppe Ambroso, who was born in 1904. Giuseppe was a farmer for the family, and he never moved to Canada. My grandmother also grew up with 3 siblings, all boys, and she was the youngest. Her brothers' names were Giovanni, Antonio, and Salvatore. My grandfather, Agostino, was born in Celico, Calabria, Italy, on April 20th, 1939. His parents, my great-grandparents, were also from Celico, and their names were Amelia Gaccino and Pasquale Barbuscio. Both were born in the year of 1911. Pasquale served in the military during World War II. Growing up, my grandfather had 3 siblings, all girls, and he was the second oldest. Their names were Maria, Gemma, and Carmelina. My grandparents first met because they didn't live too far from one another. When Agostino would go visit his aunt, him and my grandmother would play cards or hide-and-go-seek together. As the years went by, they started to date, and then on October 25th, 1959, they got married at St. Michael's Church, Maria being 16 years old and Agostino being 20 years old. On June 15, 1960, they came to Canada by boat, which docked at Halifax, and took a train 2 days and 2 nights to Toronto. When they first lived in Toronto, they stayed with one of my grandmother's brothers, Antonio, for 3 months. My grandparents decided to come to Canada because one of my grandmother's brothers lived here, and also because in Italy there wasn't many jobs for women, so they decided to come to Canada because there would be more job opportunity for both of them. The first job my grandfather had was working at a gas station, and he was making $50 a week. After this job, he worked as a mechanic, then became a construction worker, and then worked at Ford for a while. Then he went back to construction. The first job my grandmother had was working in a toy factory, and she made 54 cents an hour. Then as the years passed, she moved to different jobs, but it was always involved in a factory. As the years went by, my grandparents gave birth to 3 children, one being my mom. My parents started dating after high school, my mom being 18 and my dad being 19. They dated for 6 years, and on August 20th, 1988, my parents got married. On May 20th, 1991, my mom gave birth to her first child, my sister, Lisa DiDio. And on December 6, 1996, my mom gave birth to her second child, me. Hi, my name is Gabriella DiDio. I'm 15 years old. I go to Bill Crothers Secondary School. I play soccer and have been since I was 4 years old, and this is my place in Canadian history.